A very good morning to all of our viewers, and thank you very much for joining us for today's third installment in CISA's Protecting Lives and Livelihoods webinar series. My name is Nombulelo Manyana, and I'll be your moderator today as we unpack whether professionalizing the state will result in improved service delivery. We'll also take a look at what value the private sector can add. Before we get started, I'd like to outline some house rules for all of our viewers. On the right-hand side of your screen, you will see the GoToWebinar panel. Please use the question section to submit any questions you'd like our panelists to answer. We will have a 20-minute question and answer session at the end of the webinar. We will try to answer as many of your questions as possible. So please do feel free to submit questions as we go. We will also have some live calls during the course of today's webinar. They will simply just pop up on your screen and you simply just need to select your answer. Joining me today to unpack today's topic, we have 4 panelists. They are Engineer Naomi Naidu, who is the director and founder of Pink Africa Consulting Engineers and a member of CISA. We also have Dr. Florentia Belvedere, who leads the state reform program at the Public Affairs Research Institute. We have Dr. Mateta Mukonyama, who leads the transport and systems and operations area at the CSIR. And last but certainly not least, we have Lindy Wendela, acting head of the Government Technical Advisory Center. Thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. Each of our panelists will give a short speech before our panel discussion, which will then be followed by our Q&A session. So please do remember to submit any questions you have for our panelists as we go. First up, we have Engineer Naomi Naidu, who will be answering a very critical question about what it looks like when infrastructure funds are spent effectively.
Thank you, Nombulelo. Good morning to my fellow panelists and viewers. On behalf of CISA, thank you for joining us on our third webinar. As you would have heard previously, the purpose of these webinars is to highlight the critical impact of infrastructure in the lives of communities and the South African economy. We continually seek to engage with various role players to guarantee that we are able to maintain our goal of saving lives and livelihoods through infrastructure delivery. So this question of what does a good life look like when infrastructure funds are spent effectively? The immediate picture that comes to mind is no load shedding, no water restrictions, but in the bigger scheme of things, we think about all citizens having access to clean water, dignified sanitation systems, safe access to electricity, communication systems, good roads. And since infrastructure acts as a support system to a sustainable economy, this also translates to high economic and social benefits to everyone, leading to a better quality of life for all citizens. And this picture looks amazing. But the truth is, this isn't the picture that we're too familiar with, especially in many parts of South Africa. So how do we get from where we are now to this good life we speak of? Firstly, I think it's important to identify the major role players involved because they all contribute to ensuring effective service delivery. And the first major role player is the one everyone loves to blame, and this is government. Probably because government is the main catalyst to infrastructure delivery. They look at proper planning of infrastructure, operations and maintenance, procurement of suitable service providers, even SME development of implementation and policies, and there's quite a bit on their plate. And the second major role player is the private sector, which encompasses the built environment, and specifically talking today about engineers. And the role of engineers, we would say, is to provide sustainable, innovative solutions, maintain good quality, and provide expert advice in their various fields of engineering. Of course, there's other that are sometimes forgotten, which is our community, which is the role, who are the direct benefactors of the project, investors who we need to subsidize our financing of infrastructure projects, and of course our politicians, whose role is to ensure that the right environment is created to implement these policies. So now that we've identified the role players, what are the issues affecting effective spending on infrastructure delivery? And this isn't necessarily talking to having insufficient funding. We're looking at how do we manage the funds that we have effectively? Because a large number of municipalities report infrastructure underspending, and it appears as if the funding is not the most critical issue when it comes to infrastructure delivery. However, many municipalities face operational and financial challenges. The Auditor General's report on municipalities for the 2018-2019 financial year produced a very dire picture, stating that only 20 municipalities in the country achieved a clean audit, while 28 municipalities didn't even submit in time. And some of the issues that came through from the AG report, there was a handful, but I mean, there was quite a lot, but just a few to highlight a few: wasteful and irregular expenditure, improper procurement processes, poor adherence to financial controls, poor asset management, high rate of vacancies in key positions, poor project monitoring, high levels of non-compliance with legislation governing municipal finance and accounting processes. Of course, these issues do not apply to all South African municipalities. In fact, we do see a number of very efficiently run municipalities that are even winning prestigious international awards. So this is in no wise a blanket statement to government. But the AG's report does highlight the need for critical skills that should be in states employed to ensure proper management of state funds. Furthermore, when we look specifically at infrastructure spend and the report on poor asset management, poor project monitoring, wasteful and irregular expenditure, we understand the imperative need for technical capacity within the state if we want to see improved service delivery. We should note that a number of municipal officials do express concern over the limitations they experience regarding policy. The lack of appropriate policy and framework can sometimes lead to unfruitful expenditure. It's slowly being addressed in some of the municipalities, but it does raise the concern and need for technical input in the procurement process as well. Of course, there's other factors contributing to ineffective spending on infrastructure projects like community stoppages, political interference, business forums, corruption, etc. But we're focusing on the solutions we can provide as an industry. And talking about solutions, it is important to understand that all role players contribute to the solution in addressing these issues that plague the industry infrastructure delivery process. And while government has to undertake the process of addressing some of these issues internally, there's a large number of issues that can be resolved by working together with the engineering private sector. There's a simple short-term solution. The government needs skills, industry has the skills required. Government needs to harness the valuable pool of resources available in the private sector. A lot of project risk is mitigated by using professional service providers, and government needs to latch onto this. And of course, looking at long-term solution, the long-term solution is to implement skills transfer processes to make sure that there's a continuous pipeline of professionals within the state. And this solution includes transformational processes that address the race and gender inequalities in the industry. So what does a good life look like when infrastructure funds are spent effectively for improved service delivery? I would say it's all parties working together to achieve a common goal to ensure a good life for all citizens. And the drivers of this goal are the professionals within the state. Therefore, professionalizing the state is indeed an absolute priority.
Thank you very much, Naomi, for that presentation and the insight that you've just shared with us. This leads us straight into the first poll, which has just popped up on your screens. It asks, in the quest to provide, protect and maintain lives and livelihoods, what is the current reality of SA's infrastructure? Naomi, as you can see that in the poll responses, a lot of people, 9% voted that it is satisfactory, 20% said it is improving, and a whopping 70% said it's failing. Do you have any insights into that?
Yes, I think the vast majority are correct. It does appear as if infrastructure is failing. It really depends where you are situated. As I said, there are some municipalities that are working to try and improve this infrastructure delivery. And we've seen improvements happening in isolated cases, but the vast majority, yes, it does appear as if it is failing us.
Thank you very much for that insight. Next up, we have Dr. Florencia Valverde, who unpacks the government's intent to professionalize public service.
Thank you very much, Nambulelo, and good morning to my fellow panelists and certainly the participants joining us. And thank you, CISA, for allowing PARI an opportunity to participate in this webinar. I think, PARI over the last few years has been focusing on issues of professionalizing the public service and also focusing on bringing reform to key areas such as the public procurement space. So we, as Naomi was saying, I mean, the importance of professionalizing the public service is key in terms of service delivery and being able to ensure that we protect lives and livelihoods. And what I wanted to talk about today was just run through some of the initiatives that government has been undertaking to professionalize the public service. And one of them is, some of you might have seen it, it is on the website of the National School of Government, was the publication of a draft national implementation framework towards the professionalization of the public service that was published in December 2020. And there was a call for comments from everyone. And then there was also a process of online consultations with different sectors of society. And we did, as PARI, make submissions on the framework. And generally, we welcome it in the sense that this is hopefully getting us one step closer to many of the commitments made in the National Development Plan and the medium-term strategic framework to indeed build a capable state and increase state capacity. And the framework actually stresses the importance of professionalization and of insulating the public service from undue political interference. So those are things that we certainly welcome, given where we've come from in the last decade. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. It presents 5 key pillars as part of the process of professionalization, starting from issues of recruitment to induction, onboarding, training, career progression, and then also career incidents. And there's some possibility for cooperation with the private sector in many ways. I mean, let's keep in mind that the framework as it's been together so far is targeted right now at senior managers. And I think the importance of this framework is once it starts cascading lower down in government. There's a lot of issues don't just affect senior managers, but so there's a lot of emphasis on issues of preemptive exams and ongoing training, the possibility of public servants doing some time in the private sector, doing like a rotation and gathering skills and picking up other knowledge that they can bring back to the public sector with them. There's the issue around ensuring meritocracy in the recruitment and selection of people in the public service. And there is quite an emphasis here also on working with professional bodies and professional associations to ensure that indeed the individuals that are being selected do qualified or are certified and are people with the integrity required. And the framework also talks about this idea of partnerships, of building partnerships with a number of stakeholders in civil society, and certainly the National School of Government has made a call, I think, on institutions to support or find ways of working with it in terms of its training programs. So there are some opportunities to establish that collaboration and cooperation. And also the framework talks about initiating consequence management through some of the mechanisms that exist for professional bodies or associations, as well as the amendments to the Public Audit Act. Now, like I said, I mean, we do welcome the fact that there are a number of very positive aspects that are raised by the framework. However, one of the things that does come up is that, you know, it's very much input driven, right? Lots of training, lots of pre-entry exams, competency tests, and so on and so forth. But there isn't really a linkage to how are these things getting us closer to enhance service delivery or enhance adherence to constitutional values and principles as public servants are expected to do. So there's a lot of inputs being made, but we're not sure how that is going to be measured and monitored to say, okay, we are seeing improvements because we have that. And that's because a lot of times, you know, as much as we might want to impart skills, we need to create a broader environment of integrity. And there needs to be assessment and monitoring, whether it is not only performance management, but also consequence management, where there is no compliance with particular rules and prescripts. So that's the second part of, you know, the second broad criticism that we make is that it's almost like performance management and consequence management are not seen as part of this process of professionalization. And we argue that if you're trying to professionalize a public service, you need to be able to show those who are engaging in this process that there are consequences if you don't. And that so also to create an incentive to say we're all committed to this, and when somebody steps out of line, that person would be taken to task. Now, it's as much as it's important to link issues around, for instance, consequence management to the standards and what is expected of, say, technical professionals, right? What is expected of the professional bodies to adhere to, whether it is an attorney or whether it is an engineer. We argue that that's not enough, because a lot of times that aspect of consequence management might only be triggered by a particular complaint by somebody. As an attorney, for instance, I belong to the Legal Practice Council. I pay my membership fee, and I continue to exist in this medium. I would only find out if there's something wrong with me if somebody raises a complaint about my behavior or my treatment of somebody. So consequence management cannot really be just delegated to whatever the professional bodies or associations are implementing. Rather, it could be a factor to take into consideration, and on the expectations of not only performance, but also in terms of, the accountability in terms of doing that work. So there is room to improve that. And again, I mean, we've seen very recently, you know, this issue of consequence management when we see the need to prioritize it as well. Very recently, Minister Munu indicated that between, I think, the 1920 financial years and the 2021 financial years, over 4.5 billion rands have been spent on paying the salaries of suspended public servants, both in national and provincial level. So, and people being suspended for almost 2 years. So that's also an issue that, you know, we can't afford. We have to definitely move these processes forward. And I think the last criticism, the third broad criticism is that the framework, as much as it's meant to be an implementation framework with short-term, medium-term, long-term activities, it doesn't really give us a bit of a roadmap on what is going to be done when. A lot of it is still aspirational. Things are there, but we don't know when they're going to take place, and we don't want this to be delayed for a very long time. And so some of the key recommendations for us, I mean, we welcome the idea that it echoes for instance, the fact that there needs to be a head of the public service instituted, that position created, right, to make sure that in selecting and recruiting people, we do so on the basis of skills and merit and not political connections. So the importance of having a head of the public service and the role of the Public Service Commission would play a key role in terms of selection and the establishment of selection panels to select people. It would also include key subject matter experts or representatives from professional associations as well. So that is very much welcome. The problem is that we don't have a sense of how this head of the public service is going to be hired and recruited in the first place. So there's a possibility that that figure itself might be very much imbued in kind of political connections. And then it would just be a situation where we're just transferring the problem we experience in terms of political interference to another level. So we talk about the importance of making sure that the process of the selection of the head of the public service is done where the Public Service Commission plays a particularly critical role there. We also talk about the fact that integrity testing and competency testing shouldn't be a once-off thing. For recruitment purposes. I think these are things that need to continue to be done on a regular basis, particularly integrity tests. And this is something that is already, it is flagged in some of the existing legislation affecting the public service. It's the same with a conflict of interest and disclosing your interests. Those need to be cascaded down to supply chain management personnel, finance personnel, those sitting in bid adjudication committees and whatnot. And those, are seen as a once-off event, but you might be have lots of integrity when you start, but as you work in the public service, that could generate. So it's definitely important that that is an ongoing process. We certainly need the DPSA, and we certainly need, they've got a role in terms of supporting government departments in terms of consequence management and ensuring that there is a monitoring of this. And I think we definitely need this quite a bit. And also, I think the other aspect that I just wanted to highlight is that it's important that people become certified. I think it's critical. It gives a level of, at least for meeting some minimum standards. But again, we can't just look at these things in isolation. The fact that I might be an attorney or I might be an engineer and I'm certified as that by a professional body doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to carry out my work in line with those standards and what is expected of me. So there needs to be that ongoing assessment and monitoring. Somebody is indeed adhering to those standards and those standards set. And we don't, and again, we need to also make sure how, as much as the framework is putting a lot of emphasis on using the standards of professional bodies to assess performance and whether there should be consequences, that needs to be clarified. So I don't think it's straightforward as it's shown, I think, or argued in the framework. And again, I also talked about the role of the DPSA's ethics unit, right? I think there's also another thing that we need to consider here is that sometimes it's not just a question of skills. There's some very competent people working in government who are often told to follow instructions, but not necessarily lawful instructions. I think the SIU report that came out in February this year, looking at the PPE procurement, there were many instances where lower level staff were asked to maybe engage in conduct that wasn't necessarily procedurally correct. And therefore, we also need to have mechanisms for those individuals who are trying to do the right thing have an opportunity to raise that and to blow the whistle on that. And certainly PARI has written in its submissions on the public procurement bill, also a recent policy brief, we talked about the idea of incentivizing whistleblowing as another mechanism to enhance this accountability. And I think lastly, what I would say is also this professionalization drive, really, as much as it needs to focus on the senior levels, it definitely needs to be drilled down. And we've certainly called in our also submissions on the public procurement bill, we need to ensure that there's not only, like I said, integrity testing and the way we hire individuals at lower levels that are involved in finance, in supply chain management, and the use of committees and the use of subject matter experts in making those decisions, but also the importance of bringing in, at the time of deciding on tenders, that we do that the public service also makes use of those individuals that do have those skills, right? I think a lot of times what you get is that in a bid adjudication committee, there might be individuals who don't have the skills to be able to assess whether the bids that they're getting actually meet the requirement and they qualify and so forth. So sometimes there's a bit of separation between who's adjudicating and who actually needs the service, and there needs to be a much closer link between the two. And then again, I think we've got to implement some of the existing prescripts that haven't quite come into effect, such as those that are contained in the Public Administration Management Act, the PAMA Act. It also tries to bring some measures around conflict of interest and disclosures, so that we also hold those individuals accountable. So I think we you know, in a nutshell, I think we've got to be positive about the fact that the government is taking these steps in putting out there a framework that is aimed at starting that long process of professionalization. And I think it is incumbent on all of us to engage in that process and, you know, both criticize positively and negatively, but certainly continue to be involved and push for it to continue, and not for it to be, you know, delayed or stalled, as we have seen. I mean, you know, the NDP has been around for many years, and we certainly now more than ever need to ensure that we've got a professionalized public service and that recruitment and personnel practices are certainly based on much more on merit than on undue political interference, as we've seen the effects of that. And I know that today we're also competing with other events taking place in our country. But so let me stop there. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Florentia, for that presentation. Apologies to our viewers, we were experiencing a few technical issues, but our technicians are on it and they are fixing it. You will now have 40 seconds to submit your answers to our second poll of the day, which has just popped up on your screens. It asks you, what would it take to achieve a capable, efficient, and effective state? You have 30 seconds now to answer our poll. Thank you very much to all of our viewers who answered our poll. Dr. Florentia, interestingly enough, you spoke about the consequence and performance management in your presentation. Are you surprised to see that only 12% of people voted that that is what it would take to achieve a capable and efficient state?
Well, actually, Nambulelo, the findings are quite telling. I mean, if you look at it, it's not so low because the overwhelming majority are saying all of these factors are important. And I think that is the point that I'm trying to make, is that as much as one can get skills, and we can, you know, there can be a lot of collaboration, I think, between certainly professions, professional bodies, government, civil society, to impart those skills to individuals. But the problem is that imparting of those skills is not enough. You've got to create an environment where those skills are respected. And it's not just, a lot of times, like we talk about technical skills, but a lot of what sometimes is missing in government is that basic management, performance and consequence management, and also just living by example. Because if we're trying to convince people to change and to jump on this move to professionalize, we've got to act the part as public servants. So it's not surprising. I think people do get it, that one needs a combination of things. So it's quite encouraging that people have a well-rounded view of what is required. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Florentia, for your presentation and sharing your insight on our poll. Up next, we have Dr. Mateta Mukonyama, who will run us through what needs to be done to attract and retain engineering skills to build institutional capacity.
Once more, good morning, Nombulelo, all the viewers and fellow panelists. I worked in the public sector in a city, metropolitan municipality previously. I've worked in the private sector as well, and semi, public research institutions, as well. I've also, currently I interface with, colleagues across all spheres of government in South Africa and elsewhere, globally. When I got into the profession, I was very fortunate to have very good mentors. I was very fortunate to have good leaders in the organizations in which I worked. Even from university, I used to have very good, lecturers, essentially conveying a message that I mattered. One would make, one of the lecturers would make some time for me to get a sense of where things are. And even after finishing off my degree, civil engineering degree, made time to come to my workplace to say that you matter. When in the workplace, I had mentors who essentially conveyed the same message, that you matter. When I worked in a city, same thing. I used to have a leader who came and said, essentially you matter. But then also that the leader who was there, I often say when I was in the city, working in the city, it was a university of getting things done. So you had a leader who, the message was, we can do it. We can do it. In consulting, private sector as well, I had a leader who said, we can do it. It is possible. But now I contrast it with what I'm seeing now, going back to where I was in local government. And the few engineers that I interact with, the one recently says, for a year, I haven't had a computer to work with. I don't have it. Let alone all these, software, computational, facilities that I need to have to just be on the same page with you. I don't have that. And to be able to do something, you have to, apply, to be able to do something. There's paperwork to be done. You need to motivate, write memos on a green paper, on a blue paper, and make sure that there's no auditor who will find that you skipped a line and then be taken for a disciplinary hearing and all manner of things. So creating that culture of fear. So as long as you do not have leaders who are able to show that things can be done and create the right kind of environment, you will not be able to attract engineers, because engineers are there to be part of solutions. A survey was done by one of the students at university, I think Pretoria, to see what motivates engineering students to study engineering. And on top of it, it was to be part of solution, creating innovative solutions based on science and mathematics. So that is what drives them. And when I get into an environment where I have to be fearful, I don't get an opportunity to solve problems, that's it, I'm gone. And I look at the cities that I work with, very, very few engineers. And chances of attracting those engineers are very, very low, given the environment that is there. And I believe the solution is probably mainly twofold, is the leadership. If you have a bad leader, to reverse and restore that, to that institution takes a long time. If you have a bad, junior staff, it can fix things quickly. But if you have a very bad leader at the top, it will take you years. And often, when you have bad leaders, they attract, bad practitioners in the organization. So it becomes that cycle. So you need to solve things at a leadership level. But there also, second, is the bureaucracy, especially created by Treasury. If you look at the rules and regulations that Treasury has come up with over the years, since the late 90s, they have created an environment that is just, so create a culture of fearness. And so, you cannot procure, you cannot talk to, someone, so engineers find it very difficult to thrive in such situations. So Treasury needs to relook at, the tons and tons of rules that are there. And I heard, Dr. Belvedere just now, we don't need many more rules. I don't think so. I think we need leadership that knows what to do and create a proper environment. Let me stop.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mateta, for your insight. We will now be launching our third poll, which looks at where the weakest link is in the engineering skills pipeline. You will have 30 seconds to answer this poll. Thank you very much to everyone who voted. Dr. Mateta, we're looking at the results. What are your insights on that? Looking at the fact that, 58% of people voted that it is in procurement and of engineering services.
Yeah, it's interesting. The lowest there is university. So essentially, there's an agreement that universities are doing a fairly good job relatively, but the moment you get into the work environment, there are no opportunities. Opportunities in the form of, procurement of services, creation of projects, attractive, projects. And we've seen in the build-up to 2010 World Cup. I think we had, a few years before 2010 World Cup, the industry, civil engineering industry, electrical engineering industry, they were booming because projects were being created, and you were attracting skills in a lot of this organization. So and we got things done. But since then, I think we were plateauing a little bit. So I definitely agree. I agree with that. But part of the problem here is the tons of rules and regulations that don't help us as a country. You have tons of this procurement legislation that just creates a culture of fear. It is better for me not to make a decision than to make a decision to procure, because I just want to be safe. So Treasury needs to look at those things and reform and make sure that we create a conducive environment for the engineering industry to thrive. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mateta, for that insight. Lastly, we have Lindiwe Ndlela, who will be talking about building state capacity for efficient and effective financial management.
Thank you very much, Nombulelo. I'm smiling because I also realize that I'm the only public servant on the panel. And Mateta, I come from the Treasury home. So thank you very much for inviting GTEC, the Government Technical Advisory Center, here to talk a little bit about what we do in to basically do our bit in building state capability. And because we sit in the Treasury, we obviously want to build state capability for effective and efficient financial management. That can be interpreted in any different number of ways. Could be narrow. Do we do training or technical support in financial management? Yes, we do. It can be interpreted broadly and widely in a sense that we choose the projects that we feel are strategic in furtherance of government's mandate, and just making sure then therefore that the project from beginning to end, from I think scoping it to delivering it and to kind of quality assuring it is done properly, and so that it can be used and is practical for the said department that has requested that service. That also is what we do. So I'll also greet our participants here, and I am looking forward to the conversation later on, I think, in the panel discussion. But I think as a way of introducing why is it that I'm here, just to explain to you that GTEC basically furthers the mandate of the National Treasury to assist organs of state in building their capacity for efficient, effective, and transparent financial management. Now, I've just said a mouthful about what that is and simplified it a little bit for you. What we do basically and why we established was to basically create an arm's length relationship between Treasury's mandate to regulate and its mandate also to support, because I think of all of the policy departments that tend to regulate, they also have a responsibility in terms of our constitution to also support government. So that's how GTEC was born out of that, and it was then established as a component, which in a sense is kind of like I call it a building of a cottage in the same house. So government comes to us to get support in interpreting or in traversing what needs to be done, so that Treasury can then focus on its role to regulate as much as it can. But obviously we are the support arm for that, and we house largely a number of support functions that Treasury has. Some of them are still within Treasury, but some of them are sitting in GTEC. So in a sense, we assist spending departments by providing technical support, as I said earlier, and policy advice, as well as institutional development support. How we do it is by using a blended resourcing model of officials, complemented by contracted skills, which are pooled, and I'll say a little bit about that just now. And then obviously we can also go to the market to complement the skills that we don't have. The officials, therefore, what it means is that GTEC becomes quite lean in a sense in terms of officials, so that we don't add to the burgeoning wage bill. So we are quite lean. I think as an organization, we are about 150, and 2/3 of that component is contracted skills. And then on top of that, we have about 30 technical advisors who are on a 5-year contract that's supposed to end now, and we are refreshing that pool. And we are also in the process of making sure that our panel is in place to make it easy for us to get the skills as quickly as possible. So the skills that we focus on just in terms of pooling them is the skills that are too scarce to be available to departments on a full-time basis, or for which demand is limited to short periods and for particular fixed duration projects. So for a department to hire a transaction advisor, for example, for its procurement for procurement of its infrastructure, it wouldn't be wise for them to hire an official to do that, because they'll need those skills only insofar as they want to spend that. They might have officials that understand infrastructure, for example, but obviously once you put together a team that delivers infrastructure, we all know that it's a multidisciplinary team made up of engineers, of lawyers, of analysts, of other skills that are required in the delivery of that particular infrastructure. So it wouldn't be wise to get all of those skills and have them available at all times in government. It wouldn't be efficient otherwise. So we pool those skills and we make them available to departments as and when they are required. And that's why we exist. So in a sense, GTEC creates the potential for government to economize on these activities. We work in the space of infrastructure delivery. We basically are the unit that supports the PPPs and the delivery of large infrastructure. So when departments want to register a public-private partnership, for example, in the delivery of infrastructure, they have to register it with the National Treasury, and then that kind of triggers the support that we provide to the department, to the public entity, to be able to protect their interests as they engage with the private partner. The other area in which we work is us conducting spending reviews, so that when government budgets are being cut, they are done in a way that is informed by what's necessary and what's not necessary. We also engage in program management, not in terms of a budget program, but in terms of the specialized programs that assist government in achieving its objectives as quickly as possible. And in this regard, we house the Jobs Fund. Some of you may have heard of the Jobs Fund, but we also house the Municipal Finance Improvement program. I saw that Naomi was talking about the fact that government needs the skills and the private sector has those skills. So we kind of sit like a bridge in between to be able to assist government to access those skills, use them effectively, and when they don't need them, not have them available to them and not know what to do with them. But again, we also work in institutional and organizational development in most instances. And these are projects that we do on a consultancy basis. So this model, in terms of GTEC, what it enables us to do is that it enables us to achieve economies in the contracting and the management of professional services contracts. It also enables us to manage an accelerated process for commissioning of professional services. And then it helps us render consistent quality management processes across a range of projects that government may need. So I don't also want to create this impression that we do everything for everybody. We work on a demand-led basis. So government departments will write to us and require our skills, and we will respond. We will obviously weigh the project and see if it's a project that can be done by us, and then we do it. In our legal notice, we are also not allowed to compete with the private sector. So we don't compete for business of government. And as I said, we're a small team. We do what we can, but what we contribute towards is that outcome that's looking at the ethical and capable state. I'll stop there, and I'm sure there will be questions later and when we discuss. Thank you so much, Nambulelo.
Thank you very much, Linda, for your presentation and sharing that important insight into how GTEC works. We are now going to launch our last poll, which has popped up on your screen right now. It asks you, how would you rate the partnership between academic institutions and various industry bodies? Linda, are you surprised at the results of the poll, or because it says that 76% said that it needs improvement and 20% said that it is satisfactory, while only 4% said it's very good?
Nambalela, I think I'd like to have a conversation after this with the 4%. That says it's very good. But I largely agree with the with the sentiment that this partnership requires improvement. I think South Africa is really not good at collaboration. You know, you even look at our universities, you look at the curriculum, you look at the courses that they offer. And on the one hand, one can understand that you want the subject matter to be delivered closest to the people. You don't want somebody living in Polokwane to have to go to Cape Town for a public management course, for example. So you'd want that. But universities don't collaborate. Civil society organizations do not collaborate with others. They are good at collaborating with other civil society organizations, but they're not so good at collaborating with others. So the issue of state capability being built and being improved, I think it's been a topic that we've been talking about today. From Naomi to Mateta, we've been, to Florencia and Mateta, we've been talking about how that needs to be done. It is a big elephant. It needs to be taken in little chunks. So it is important that there is collaboration. So what we are doing in GTech is that we've built our capacity, or we're in the process of building our capacity for partnerships. We've got a unit dedicated specifically on building partnerships and kind of like creating that bridge between the NSG, between research institutions. And we want to do it at the point where they are already organized, so that it's easy for us. So we've got partnerships that we have with UNU wider, with NRF, the National Research Foundation, which kind of like pulls together all the researchers from all the universities so that we can work with them on that basis. But I don't think it's something that should be left only to GTech. I think government should be able to be open to these kinds of partnerships. But you heard what Mateta says, and I don't disagree with him at all. Because I don't think even in terms of the new procurement bill that's on the table or any other legislation that's there is something that encourages those kinds of partnerships, so that things that don't fall in with supply chain or as procurement, there's very little room and there's very little understanding of how those things work and how they can work. So government needs to be open to those sorts of partnerships, and private sector needs to be able to participate in those things, and civil society for that matter. So I agree with the 74-75% that says it needs improvement, but not only improvement, it needs particular attention, because if we are to build this country, we need to be able to know that government can't do it alone, the civil service, the private sector can't do it alone. So it requires everybody to just come and act in concert. But as I think my fellow panelists have said, that government kind of like is the holder of the ball. It's like the boy holding the ball, the child holding the ball, and therefore it needs to open itself up to that kind of help from outside of itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindia, for sharing your insights, and thank you to all of our panelists for their presentations and the insight that they've shared with us today. We will now welcome all of our panelists back and we'll proceed to the panel discussion. Just a quick reminder to all of our viewers to submit any questions you might have for our speakers, which we will tackle at the end in our Q&A session. I think the first question I'm going to pose to Ms. Lindiwe. How important do you think it is for government to hold their employees accountable for service delivery?
Well, I think it's very important, and we, like everything else we say in South Africa, we've got the blueprint, we've got the rules. They're there. I mean, if you look, it's not as if there are no rules. There is a performance management system in government. Whether it's now being implemented appropriately is another question. So absolutely. I mean, the short answer to the question is that yes, they should be held accountable for that. But I think what I want to include in that answer is what Mateta was talking about. You need to look at the entire culture in the public service. If the culture of fear rules the day, nothing's going to happen. So if somebody does not sign that order that says we are procuring these skills because they're too scared of something else like the PAMA or anything else that they will end up in jail, and they don't sign, service delivery is not going to happen. So there actually has to be a balance to that. Yes, they should be held responsible, but yes, we need to be addressing the culture, the leadership, the culture, and we also need to understand that government needs to be a learning, create a culture of learning. You make mistakes. Surely you come down hard on those that are corrupt, but if people are not allowed to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. So, and if you look at the rules, they talk about discipline in the public service being progressive. So you start small. You start with counseling. It's followed up by first warning and all of those things. If we can do that, then yes, absolutely, we should do that. Thank you.
Dr. Florentia, I'd also like for you to jump in there with, I see that you are nodding your head in agreement, but also you've done extensive research in this particular issue and you spoke about, you touched a bit on it. How important do you think it is for government to hold the employees accountable?
Well, it's critical, right? Because you're trying to establish a standard, or you're trying to uphold a particular standard of behavior and performance. And if there's people who are getting away with not being held to account for not doing that, and what is the incentive for me to do what is expected of me? If I know that I will continue to earn my salary, I will, without really doing anything. So it doesn't contribute towards that improved service delivery. But I think also, this issue about the culture of fear, I think is very important, because I think there's a lot of people, and we've been hearing that. If we look at, for instance, some of the repercussions against people who've been whistleblowers in the public, in whether it is in the public sector or whether it is in SOEs, we've been hearing that in the Zondo Commission. People's lives are destroyed. So a lot of times, even though they're trying to do the right thing, consequences are so high for doing that. So it's very important to have that aspect of consequence management directed at the people who are doing the wrong things, and not also those who are trying to trying to do what is correct by blowing the whistle, and they being persecuted in many ways. So yeah, I think it's absolutely critical. It's part of the same coin of professionalization. Yeah. Thanks.
Dr. Mateta, you spoke about the culture of fear, which both Lindiwe and Dr. Florentia have also mentioned. How do you think we can kind of work to cancelling out that culture of fear for people to kind of report when things are happening that are not supposed to be happening?
With my team, we get quite a few youngsters, coming through. Engineering graduates, computer scientists, and so forth. One of the first things I say to them is, if I don't hear that you've broken something, you have, you've done something with the software, the system, is not down because you did something, then you're not doing your work. So we need to create that. I agree completely. With Lindiwe, a culture of allowing people to learn, to make mistakes. But it requires leadership. It requires leadership to create such an environment. I mean, look at the HR department of institutions. That's one of the worst designed, I think, components of organizations, because you've got just people who could even be robots in some cases, because you don't want to think. You just say, there's a rule, there's a policy like this, and therefore, because there is such a blue whatever, this is what we are going to do. not in the interest of the business, not in the interest of the organization, just because there are systems. You need leaders to create a culture, a good culture to make the business, thrive. But this, rule-based is a substitution for leadership, and it's not good. It will not take us anywhere, especially in South Africa, where we need innovation to get out of the backlogs that we have. We don't need more rules. We need to create a culture. We need more leaders. Going forward.
Naomi, I see you were also kind of nodding in agreement with what Dr. Mateta was saying. Are you in agreement with everything that he's saying?
Yes, definitely. I think it's, if you look at a young engineer coming out of university, they don't actually teach you how to live in the real world. We always say they just teach you the academic stuff and the theoretical information that you need to know. And then when you go out, it's a whole different aspect. And I can imagine that going into the public sector is actually much worse, because you still need to build up your technical capabilities, and then you have a whole lot of other aspects that you need to be aware of. So I think in conjunction with creating an environment where you don't live with fear of every move that you make is watched, but also to create an environment of learning so that young people coming into the industry or into public sector specifically can learn the different processes, how to handle different situations, and not have to just respond suddenly when they confronted with something, and then they may make the wrong decision. So I think it's something that needs to be spoken about, and everybody made aware of it, so that it's not something new when it does pop up eventually.
I think one common theme I've also picked up with what everyone has been saying today is that it's not just government's responsibility. So I'd like to ask Naomi, what value do you think the private sector can add in professionalizing the state?
Okay, I think Lindiwe has shown us very beautifully how this partnership can work. But there's I think in the short term, definitely, by involving specialized professionals to assist with developing the scope of whatever the project you want to put out, goes a long way down the line, when quite often it's the lowest price that's considered, and there's not the right professionals involved, and then it results in additional expenditure that has to be put out, or projects are on hold, and a lot of problems that come through, quality issues. So I think involving the private sector, and more specifically experienced professionals right at the start, ensures that the quality is maintained right through on the project, and this keeps your spending in check, and also allows room for innovation on the projects, because that is what we want to see. We want to see innovation and good quality coming through. And I think that's where the private sector can definitely add value. And also when we talk about the skills transfer, we know that not everybody in the public sector doesn't always have the capabilities to develop the individuals within the state. So they need to make use of the skill set from the private sector, so that they could upskill the public sector employees as well. And I think that that's the critical factors that can add value to the public sector.
Dr. Mateta, I'd like to throw this one to you as well. How do you think, or what value do you think the private sector can add, and how can they do that?
I think where the private sector can really add value is on the absorption of risk. Especially with very large projects. But we have come to a point where the government is too dependent on consultants, and that is not good. You need a very good mix. It cannot be that everything that you do is done by a consultant, and not even a single person can defend the work that has been done. And we do quite a lot of work, in the public sector. And there's that reluctance to learn, take over, and present, ideas. And so we need a good balance. But I believe the private sector is more valuable in high risk projects, where you really want to get cheap money. You want to reduce the risk, to minimize the cost of borrowing. So a lot of investors would want to make sure that you've got all your T's crossed and the I's dotted. So there's a lot of value there that they can absorb. A bit of risk-sharing models can be explored in that regard. But I have a problem where public sector has to then make a lot of profits from government work. It doesn't sit very well to say that we've made so much profit out of basic service delivery kind of things. Those sort of things should be embedded in the public sector. The local municipalities should be able to do those things. To make a profit out of those things, to me, it is not ethical. So over time, we need to be serious, to be deliberate in how we build capacity in local government. We need it more than ever.
Dr. Florentia, I'd like to throw this particular question to you. Do you believe that government values professionally registered service providers, or do they only focus on price when adjusting tenders?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think, in principle, let me put it in theory, there is an emphasis on those individuals who are certified, who are qualified, who are, the focus is there, right? At least on paper. I think where these issues then get diluted or not dealt with is in kind of the decision-making process and the kinds of interference that creep in. So a lot of times there is a lot of fallback on, I think particularly if you're looking at some of the committees and who is evaluating these bids, a fallback often is which one is the cheapest option when you're having to assess different tenders, and price becomes kind of a fallback position. But at the same time, the problem there is that you might have really good skills and it might be more expensive, but sometimes that's not what guides the decision making. The concern is the quality, whether those individuals making the decisions have the necessary skills and knowledge to make those decisions in the first place. So I think it might get sampled that those that are the most qualified might not necessarily be the ones who might get a particular project or tender, unfortunately. And that's why a lot of the work that we've done is looking at how do we even select the individuals occupy some of those positions, and what are some of the skills that those individuals should have. I mean, I agree with Dr. Mateta when he's talking about the need to, it can't just be rules-based, you need to have flexibility in many ways. And that's where sometimes procurement becomes very cumbersome because of that. Too many rules. I mean, even, the existing rules that govern the kind of procurement space is massive, but we've got to have, at the same time, we've got to be able to respect some very basic scripts of how people are selected, and making sure that the people who are making the decisions are capable of doing that, so that we don't end up with really, projects that are not seen to completion, and it's all about acquaintances getting those kinds of tenders. So I would say that's the reality, unfortunately.
Yes. I'd like to also, with that answer, I see, Lindy, would you like to jump on that?
Yeah, I'd like to come in because I think there is a thread. In its truest sense of procurement, what's supposed to happen is that companies or bidders have to compete on functionality first. Okay. So at the end of the day, and I'm saying in its truest sense, I'm not saying that the system in some instances is not kind of like damaged or broken, but in its truest sense, if you look at the intentions of those SCM regulations, that bidders are supposed to all be capable. Those that make it through the first gate are the ones that are supposed to be able to do the job. And then the price thing comes in a bit later. What we are not talking about here, and I'm not saying much about it, is that in our, I think, preferred procurement system is that you then look at those that qualify, those that have the lowest price, and then you do your BEE as well in terms of that. You know, so I think the intentions of the systems are noble, but in application, something creeps in there. Because honestly speaking, the lowest bidder is still supposed to have qualified functionally, right? So that's the theory, that's the law, that's the principle. The application is somehow probably missed through the committee system. The second thing I wanted to chip in on is this issue around the risk sharing that Mateta is talking about. I like that because what we have now is quite a codependent relationship. As much as there is an over-reliance on consultants, there are some consultants that are over-reliant on government and they're making huge profits out of government. So like any bad marriage where there's codependency, you need to fix the root causes of it. And part of what we are talking about here in terms of state capability, you want to build the state so that officials can do what they were hired to do. There is always going to be a space for consultants. Like I said earlier on, that not everything that consultants do is meant to be done by officials. Sometimes officials will have the capability and the technical capability, but to run a 3-year research, for example, or so we just need to go back to the drawing board and say, so what is it that needs to be done on a daily basis by officials, and what are those things that you can bring in consultants for short projects and then they go, you know, in a way that does not disempower the state, so that there's this over-reliance, and then create a dependency on government by the private sector. If we can find where that line lies, I think we'll be on our way to sorting out this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lindy. I'd like to also draw attention to a comment that one of our viewers has put up. I'll read the comment for you, and I'd like Naomi to maybe unpack it a bit for us. It says, there's a trend that the entire built environment sector compete on price. This approach results in the cheapest price being accepted, and this then impacts negatively on the quality and performance of the service that is provided. Prices and costs in other professions such as medical, finance, and law have their councils upholding what the cost should be for the service that is offered. This viewer would like for you to comment. Are you in agreement with what they're saying, or do you think there's something else as well at play here?
Definitely. Okay, so there's still the process where lots of municipalities allow for functionality and then moving on to price. But lots of times the decision gets made by supply chain, and they're very adamant that the price, needs to be the deciding factor, even though the person with the lowest price didn't pass the functionality stage. So I know there's lots of internal battles between the various departments when it comes to actually selecting and because a lot of the people making the decisions in terms of the final award is not necessarily aware of what's the requirement for the project and the required skill set that's required for it. So I think it does happen very often that people end up, even good established companies end up going in very low just so that they could make it in and get the job. So that is scary because you end up sacrificing quality somehow because you cannot retain a high experienced professional full-time on that project at the price that you go in at. So there's quality that's compromised, and proper procedures, and sometimes, as we said, as was highlighted by some of the other speakers, government does rely on consultants to make decisions in certain instances, even if it is a decision that should have come from so because there's no correct person in this whole party that's qualified enough to make that decision, it ends up being a lot of unfruitful expenditure. That is exactly what happens down the line. And in addition to quality being compromised, I think also the lack of innovation. So we still want to include innovation on the projects, and that's also what government puts out. We need to see new ideas being put forward. But with these low prices, it's impossible to come up with innovative solutions. And I think this is something that needs to be addressed. I agree it works on both sides of the coin, but it's something that needs to be addressed by government, where you can't just look at the price. There needs to be a cutoff figure where you know this is not going to work if it goes below this figure, and something is going to get compromised down the line if we keep going with just the lowest figure. So I agree, working with the lowest figure is definitely not the best route to go with.
Dr. Mateta, I'd also like for you to comment on this issue, on your thoughts and what you think should be done going forward.
Yeah, look, I think that is probably a symptom, and not so much the actual cause. Price is, I think Lindiwe touched on it, earlier, to say there is theoretically there's a system in place where functionality becomes more important, but the whole procurement system there's a lot that is wrong with it, starting from the specification itself. Who's specifying this thing? Do they know what they are specifying? And to what extent should I be specifying things to the detail? What element of trust do I want to bring into the contract to make sure that there is a bit more innovation in it? So the entire procurement system, you want to look at it. So the feedback loop, we need that feedback loop to say, we have learned over the years. We've had this PFMA for the past, so many years, since the late 90s. What can we learn? How can we make things better to work in our context? It doesn't help to say, the PFMA is the second to the Constitution, when it doesn't help, to solve the problems that we have at the moment. So we need to look at, the system that you've put in place to correct, and that's where research, comes in. You need to put in a bit more research to say, what works, what doesn't work. There's a lot of data. I mean, the government procures, puts a lot of money in procurement, and there's a lot of data that you can now start collecting to help, reform the process. So you need to invest, Treasury needs to invest a lot in refining, through feedback loops.
Thank you very much for that insight. I'd like to now ask our last question. I see we have 8 more minutes, and we did receive quite a few comments about pricing and bidding. So, Ms. Lindiwe, I'd like to throw that back to you if you have anything else to add in terms of what's been said and what the comments have been so far.
Yeah, look, there is no doubt that we need to learn from the practice, right? The PFMA, I think, is as old as maybe our democracy, if not slightly younger. And it's time for any policy. There is no policy in the world that can stand great for the longest of times. You know, you create policy, you implement that policy, you learn from implementation of that policy, whether it works or doesn't work, you come back and you tweak it. And we haven't in government looked at the PFMA to say what works and what doesn't work in the PFMA. And I think there's enough, it's not just in this webinar where there is frustration about the PFMA, you know, and I think in many instances it's good. But like any good broad spectrum antibiotic is that it also kills the good bacteria that you need, you see. So you basically need to, you need to calibrate it and come back and say, okay, fine. So I do agree with the sentiments that we perhaps need to look at what has worked and what hasn't worked. And maybe it is time to review the PFMA and fix what it can, you know, because it's meant to discourage certain behaviors, and maybe in discouraging those behaviors, there's other unintended consequences, and clearly there has been. So I fully agree with my panelists and any of the comments that have been made there. But I think sometimes we don't want to be true to the letter of the law. You know, we try to find loopholes. We try to jig the system. We try to find shortcuts. And sometimes, if that happens a lot, it means there's something wrong with the law that is being implemented. So yes, I think it needs to be reviewed. I think I've said a lot on that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to throw this question to Dr. Mateta. Do we currently have the skills in the country to carry out government's planned infrastructure rollouts?
I think the country has a huge shortage, and this is true. I mean, a huge shortage of, if we're talking engineers, we've got about, the last time I checked EXA report, I said we have about 20,000, you know, professional engineers, and you know, the ones in the pipeline is about 10,000, you know, candidate engineers, and the population is growing a lot more than, you know, we're producing the skills, and a lot of the engineers also, you know, don't stay in the profession. So we have a crisis of skills. This is a fact, I believe. And we need to resolve it. And also it goes down to also the funding of our you know, higher education institutions. I looked at the numbers, you know, the number of civil engineers, for example, that we train, they have grown. I mean, during my time, we used to have, you know, 20-something, 30-something in class. Now you've got classes of 80, but you still have the one lecturer who needs to take care of all of those. And the same lecturer needs to produce, you know, research papers and do all manner of things that, you know, create brownie points, you know, for the institution. So the funding of higher education institution needs to be reviewed, looked at a bit. Private sector can play quite a big role in contributing there as well, and to create graduates who can think in the gray. It's not just about numbers. When you don't have the numbers, when you don't have the models, how do you make a decision where you don't have numbers? And I mark a lot of the scripts, you know, from undergraduates. They do poorly when it comes to reasoning. You know, just, you know, there's no wrong or right answer. They do very poorly, and so it goes to the funding, the time that, you know, lecturers have to build those skills.
Naomi, I'd like to kind of throw this one to you as well, to kind of comment on if we currently do have the necessary skills and whether you agree with Dr. Mateta.
Yes, I do agree that we have a shortage of skills. There's a number of graduates coming out of university, technicons and so on, that are unemployed. So I think one of the polls looked at that, where the shortfall was, and it was actually a procurement of work. And it has a ripple effect on the development of young people that are coming through the universities into becoming professionals. And the lack of continuous work coming through means that they don't have access to get the proper experiential training to be able to eventually register as professionals. And even if we look at the number of professionals registered in ICSA, those numbers are not in the, do not reflect, as if you compare them to the number of university students, it should translate accordingly. And you'll see that they don't, which means a lot of the students coming through do not get the proper training, do not have opportunities that they can get to that point. So they end up going to other sectors. At the end of the day, you need a job. As much as this is something you love to do, you need to get a job, and that's what happens. They end up moving to other sectors, and unfortunately, we have a lot of brains that are moving over to other sectors, and we still have a shortfall in the industry. We still left with that shortfall. So yes, I totally agree with Dr. Mateta.
Thank you very much for all of your insights. We have answered as many of the comments that we received, and most of them were about pricing, and they were about the engineers, and most of our panelists have answered them. I'd like to now give our panelists the opportunity to kind of give us some closing remarks. I'll start with Dr. Florentia.
Thank you very much, Nambulela, and thank you to everyone else. I think it's been a very useful discussion. Certainly, I'm not an expert in the engineering field, and I was just thinking, I used to work in government, and one area where I worked was home affairs, and I was just thinking about the critical skills, and engineering certainly being one of those categories that the country is trying to also import in terms of dealing with the shortages. But I think for us, you know, at PARI, and I was listening to these debates about, do we need more rules or do we need more flexibility and discretion? And I think a lot of times that's an issue that is linked to also the maturity of our democracy and of our government. And, you know, do we have, I think some of us would want for more, maybe more discretion and more flexibility to be there, for that problem solving ability to guide the actions that are to be done, thinking that somebody will act with integrity and with, you know, in the best interest of what they're doing. But a lot of times it doesn't happen. And so almost like we need to fall back on some of the rules, although I agree that many are quite constraining. But I think it's you know, hopefully it will get better as we go along. That there is that ability to be much more creative, much more flexible, much more innovative, and creating that space for that to happen. So I just wanted to just raise that as something that got me thinking from the discussions we had. But thank you very, very much. It's been very fruitful. Thanks.
Naomi, your closing remarks?
Hi, thank you again. It has been a very engaging discussion, and a lot of takeaways from it as well. And I think although it sometimes seems like it's a dire picture and things aren't going well, but I think there's still hope as long as there's still people fighting for this. And we've recognized where the shortfalls are, and together we're looking at solutions going forward. There's definitely hope that things are going to get better. And always to remember the purpose of this whole, of our purpose in providing infrastructure is for the people, the public that we serve. And I think once we keep that in mind, we always have their best interest at heart as well. Thank you.
Dr. Mateta?
Yes, thanks for the opportunity to be in this, panel. When you look at the World Economic Forum, the Global Competitiveness Report, it shows that South Africa is is on a decline institutionally. There's a lot that we can do to restore, to reverse that. But in the same report, there are some countries that have been able to recover, especially in the East. So we need to learn from those experiences. How were you able to recover? Because it is possible. It is possible to recover. The status quo is not permanent. We need to have that can-do attitude and embrace it. But for that, again, we need leaders in our institutions to be able to to embrace that. Thanks.
Last but certainly not least, Lindiwe, your closing remarks.
Thank you so much. I like the leadership question. It's like leadership is what we need, and I agree with it. My closing remark is that the issue of state capability is an important one, and it certainly cannot be left to government alone, because when you don't have your electricity, because you got a message this morning that there'll be load shedding, it's an issue of state capability. So it touches everything. It touches our inputs and our throughputs and our outputs in our universities. It touches on economic development. How do we come to play? So it's part of our civic duty, I think, to keep having this conversation around state capability and make sure that we reverse the trend that we are seeing at the moment, and I agree, Mateta, this is not a permanent state of affairs. There is a danger that we could slide if we stop having this conversation. So it shouldn't just be about this webinar, but we should just keep talking about it in our institutions, when we're at home. How do we as citizens contribute to this issue of state capability? And we need to say some things that may not be so popular to say. We all know that there's this huge debate going on about the size of the public service. That's a warranted conversation. Do we need it that big and still need consultants to help the state do its work? Let's have it. Let's be brave. And again, it is leadership, because that leadership is not only residing in our parliament or our cabinet, it also resides in our organizations as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take this time to thank all of our viewers for tuning in today, and a special thank you to our panelists for joining us to unpack this topic. It has been an excellent and very insightful discussion. We hope that this has provided some key insights into whether professionalizing the state will result in improved service delivery. If we didn't manage to answer your questions and you do have some more burning questions, we would like for you, and you'd like to engage with us regarding that, please do send us an email. Make it attention to CEO of CISA at general@cisa.co.za. I repeat, that's general@cisa.co.za. Thank you once again for joining us. This will conclude today's webinar. Until next time, stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.